Welcome back to your Monday Buckeye Talk, and it is a Mark It Down Monday. We're marking down a prediction for the 2023 Ohio State football season, and we're getting right to it. We're getting off to a flying start. We are going to mark down how many receiving yards we think Marvin Harrison Jr. will have in the 2023 football season. Doug Lesmerises, Nathan Baird, Stephen Means. We like doing these Mark It Down Mondays, Nathan. Was your idea for these? It puts us on the spot to be specific. Of course, they're easier to do the closer you get to the season. But the reason I think we should be comfortable with doing MHJ in early June, I don't know. We don't know who the quarterback's going to be, so I guess that matters. And I guess we don't 1,000% know exactly like who the play caller is going to be throughout the season, which I guess that matters. So I was going to say, I think we're comfortable doing it because I think we have the information that we need to make the prediction, but it turns out maybe we don't. But does it matter? Because this is clearly a prediction and a projection based on the skill and talent of Marvin Harrison Jr., which we know is immense. But it also obviously is not only that. It is about the people around him. It is about pass protection. It is about the guy throwing the ball. It is about the other receivers that are options. It is about the offensive philosophy that Ohio State chooses to employ. Do you think there could be major changes in how we view those other things, that what we're marking down here in early June, by the time we get to September, could it change enough for us to think, oh man, I went way high in June, I don't think that anymore? Or for us to think, man, I soft pedaled it in June. Like, I think they are ready to roll. Because I don't think our opinion of Marv is going to change, Nathan.
Right.
But could our opinion of this prediction change a lot on other things?
I don't know about a lot, but somewhat, yeah. It definitely could change. And I think that especially relates to things that we've talked about a lot on this podcast, the run pass balance, especially. If this is a team that decides, because it's a new quarterback, because of the makeup of this offensive line, that they lean just a little bit more on the run, then that obviously affects the targets for every receiver in this offense. And on top of that, we also have the unknown of exactly how other teams will defend Marvin Harrison Jr. Because as much as he was a very, very, very known commodity by the middle or end of last season, now you've had a whole offseason. Now you've had a year of a whole offseason of steady for these other teams, the game planning and everything. So how do they decide to attack him in a different way, defend him in a different way? How does Ohio State counterpunch off of that? There are some things that we can only sort of imagine right now. And if they go to one extreme or the other, could change statistically what Marvin Harrison Jr. looks like in 2023. But I think the important thing to remember about Marvin Harrison Jr., and this was true of Jaxon Smith-Njigba to some extent, if even a different extent, because it's a different position slightly in the offense, but the gravity that he has, he is such a player that the yards can sometimes be secondary. That he is affecting the game on every snap, whether he gets a ball thrown to him or not.
Stephen, do you think you might feel very differently about this situation in September than you do now? And here's the main thing, right? I think as we sit here right now, our assumption is they'll have good quarterback play. We're not 100% sure who it's going to be, but we think it'll be pretty good. Will it be CJ Stroud year 2? Probably not. But I think we have it'll be good quarterback play. Do you think that, like, that especially, because that really, right, as I have a list here, like, what are the things that would affect what we're marking down here, Stephen? The quarterback play is high on that list. How much do you think your opinion of the quarterback play could be affected by what we see in August? Are you pretty sure that, like, you think now it'll be good, August will show it'll be good, and that's not going to have a huge effect on this?
I just think the quarterback play will be good, but also I did have that thought in my head of, like, how bad does a quarterback play have to be for Marvin Harrison Jr. to not have at least 1,000 yards? Like, he's that good. You know, like, to reference another Ohio State receiver, Garrett Wilson's quarterback situation in New York last year was a blank show, to say the least, and he still had 1,000 yards. So it's like, and Marvin Harrison Jr. is better than him, with all due respect to my best friend. So, like, he's Marvin Harrison Jr. he's going to have at least 1,000 yards. Now, it might not, depending on the quarterback play, is how pretty it looks or whether it becomes record breaking. But I think his floor is a stat with a comma in it because he's Marvin Harrison Jr. And even if teams try to take him away, we've seen it at other positions. Like Joey Bosa had he was awesome as a sophomore, and then his counting numbers sucked because they triple and quadruple teamed him all year his junior year. But we haven't seen that at receiver yet because Garrett and Chris were awesome in 2019, and then they were awesome in 2020 in what would have been 1,000-yard seasons in normal years, and then they were just awesome again in 2021. With this situation, though, I think the difference is Garrett and Chris also had a new variable who ended up being even better than they were in Jaxon Smith-Njigba. And Jaxon Smith-Njigba, had he not gotten hurt, he's got the new variable of it, like, hey, Marvin Harrison Jr. is Marvin Harrison Jr. There's no Jaxon Smith-Njigba or Marvin Harrison Jr. who's going to be new to the weapons. All the weapons are the same, so I would just assume everybody's floor is some version of what they were last year.
So Marvin Harrison Jr., for the record, had 1,263 receiving yards last season. That was the fourth most in Ohio State history. Jaxon Smith-Njigba, 1,606 in 2021. David Boston, 1,435 in 1998. Terry Glenn, 1,411 in 1995. And by the way, fifth all-time is what Emeka Egbuka did last season, 1,151. That's your top four in Ohio State history. I will say the idea of he'll have at least 1,000, that to me is like, that's an injury question to me. That's the only thing there. And I did send out very specific survey categories, like how many yards do you think Marvin Harrison Jr. will have? Under 1,000 was the most pessimistic. 2%, Nathan, said under 1,000. That is only and again, he only had 263 more than that last year. It's not like he's coming off a 2,000-yard season, but I don't even know what a Ryan Day, Brian Hartline, Kyle McCord, Devin Brown, Emeka Egbuka defenses put two guys on him. I still don't think any of that would equal under 1,000.
Right. Well, now in 2021, Olave and Wilson combined for less than 2,000 yards. So that reality exists. But why did that happen? Because you had Jaxon Smith-Njigba emerge as this guy who, in the slot especially, was kind of eating up all these yards, and especially in some of the bigger games. And then Olave and Wilson didn't finish their seasons either. Like they only played 12 games for Olave, 11 for Wilson, correct?
Yeah.
So that was also a factor. But it largely, I mean, Harrison is still going to be the primary weapon in this offense. And while it'll be interesting debate maybe as we go along here. Does having a new, young, less proven quarterback make it more or less likely that Harrison gets targeted a lot? Does having a first-time offensive play caller make it more or less likely that Marvin Harrison Jr. gets targeted a lot? Does it make no difference? But does it lean one way or the other because of that's exactly who the new person might try to lean on? So the only way it would happen is if there was someone else who emerged who was so prolific that it took away from the production of Marvin Harrison Jr. That doesn't really seem to be in the cards for this offense.
Do we think there's any way that Emeka has more receiving yards, Steven, than Marvin, if both play a similar number of games and are similarly healthy? Is that on the table?
Yes, especially since Emeka's in this. I mean, he wasn't that far behind him this year, and it's like Emeka actually for a while was maybe a little bit more consistent. It's just quieter because like Marvin's got some games in there where he had like 3 or 4. There was the first couple of weeks of the year, Emeka was like consistently 5 or 6 catches for over 100 yards. So I could see that world where maybe there is a week where you don't stop Marvin Harrison Jr. He's Marvin Harrison Jr., but you can contain him. And so I can see a game similar to the Wisconsin game where maybe he has 3 catches for 45 yards, and whoever the quarterback is just hitting Emeka over the middle, hitting Emeka over the middle. He's got bubble screens. He's got the pop passes. And you look up and it's like, oh, Emeka didn't do anything flashy, but he has 11 catches for 115 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's a feasible thing because the slot position here has historically led this team in, counting numbers just because of how they get the ball.
Yeah, Ibuka had a higher yards per reception last year. He had a significantly higher yards after the catch per reception, like 3 yards per catch. So I think it's very plausible that Ibuka leads his team in receiving yards.
And then we're talking about what, like Emeka has 15 and Marvin has 1350 or something like that's the kind of, Nathan, when you say it's very plausible, is that the kind of thing you're thinking about?
Yeah, but it's something in that neighborhood. It's not like both these guys are going to push for the kind of crazy numbers that we were thinking maybe Jaxon Smith-Njigba would get last year. I don't think there's that kind of volume in this offense, especially because I said before, I do sort of think that this could be a slight lean back towards more running this year, just because of the makeup of the offense and the fact that it's a first-year quarterback.
So let's finish off the quarterback part of this. As we sit here right now, I think we all believe the quarterback play will be good. One of the things that contributed, well, I think two things contributed to my 2,000-yard prediction for Jaxon Smith-Njigba last year, which was A, Stephen, as you said, slot. We know how, right? Slot, they'd like to throw the slot. And B, the idea that CJ and Jaxon kind of had a thing. And if that's going to be like, hey, that's his guy. And you saw that emerge even in 2021. It's like, well, my gosh, it's like CJ wound up looking for Jaxon in situations when Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson were on the field. What's going to happen when they're not there? He's going to look for Jaxon all the time. Kyle McCord and Marvin Harrison Jr. played high school football together. Does that factor into anything, Steven? Do you think Kyle McCord might look for Marv because he knows Marv?
I think it matters a lot that if Kyle McCord wins the job, a guy that he spent 3 years winning state championships with and breaking Pennsylvania school records with, just so happens to also be the best player in the country, best non-quarterback in the country. I think that matters a lot. So if I won't be shocked if especially if Kyle McCord wins the job, and I won't be shocked if the Notre Dame game maybe looks like the Penn State game. And it's like, when in doubt, just find 18. Because it worked against Penn State, so I don't see why it wouldn't work for Kyle McCord.
I'm so happy. I'm so happy I have target numbers because there's a definite number of targets discussion about Marvin Harrison Jr. in big games that I think we need to have. So if it's Kyle McCord, he might look for Marv a little bit more, but anybody who's playing quarterback with half a brain would say, I don't know, throw to that guy. So we do not think, in the end, Nathan, we do not think the quarterback play will in any way hold back the statistical options for Marvin Harrison Jr. But I do think a year ago, again, when I'm throwing out crazy Jaxon numbers, part of it is it's second year CJ. How good is CJ going to be? Right. And then what winds up happening is they didn't want to chuck it around. They actually wanted to run it. Jaxon got hurt. Who knows what Jaxon would have done? But even if Jaxon had been healthy all year, he wasn't going to get the 2,000 yards the way they were playing. But CJ Stroud was a really good quarterback who was the number 2 pick in the draft. So it's not like CJ didn't live up to it. I do think, Nathan, if we agree, not going to be held back by quarterback, I'll throw this out here now. I'm not predicting a 2,000-yard season for Marvin Harrison Jr. just because I'm also not expecting the Ohio State quarterback to be at the level that CJ Stroud was as a second-year starter, Nathan, and that's part of it, right?
Yeah, and I think especially it was part of it last year when you looked at Marvin Harrison Jr. and the season that he had. Like I said, it wasn't a lot of yards after the catch. That's one area of his game that he really wants to grow, and I think it will. I think when you look historically where other great receivers typically drift towards, I think there's going to be a jump there. We'll talk about that later. But a lot of what he did, a lot of what Marvin Harrison Jr. specifically did, was the connection he had with CJ Stroud and being on the receiving end of CJ Stroud's ability to read a defense and his precision and trusting Marvin Harrison Jr. to make plays on the ball in a moment. And that is, I don't know that will be eradicated, but it has to be lessened somewhat, just as it would have been if Marvin Harrison Jr. had been a year ahead of schedule and we're playing with CJ Stroud in 2021. I don't think the connection would have been quite the same. I think there was an evolution in both of their games that led to what you saw last year. So as I was coming up with my number, it wasn't like I reduced wasn't like I came up with a number and then took only a fraction of that because it's Kyle McCord or Devin Brown. But I kind of, as I was doing some whatever ciphering of numbers, I kind of held myself back from jumping too far with it because of what we're talking about. Even as Marvin Harrison Jr. improves, it's natural to assume the quarterback play can still be very good, but might not be third year, second year starter CJ Stroud.
The yards after the catch thing is, I mean, he's brought it up a couple of times, and
Yeah.
that's something he wants to improve. But also, like, just because I wrote about it, I have the stat. He had 323 of his yards came after the catch last year. That's 4.2 yards per catch, or for a guy who averaged 16.4 yards per catch. That was tied for 199th in the country. So that is like I mean, for a guy who has a lot of tools, that is one thing where he is below average right now. And that's not shocking for a dude who's 6'4", 205. So if that's something he improves on, that also raises his ceiling for how many yards he can have, even if he has the same exact amount of touches he had this year.
Okay. Quick break. When we come back, other things that are affecting our predictions on MHJ's 2023 season. Next on Buckeye Talk. All right, Nathan, so you brought up stylistic choices, run pass balance, how they're going to want to attack people. How did you factor that into your evaluation here? And again, I wound up being 180 degrees wrong on this last year. I thought it's like, all right, well, they're going to come out in 2022 with CJ in year 2, with Jaxon, with Marv, and then you got to chuck it around. Just chuck it around. And they were like, no, we want to prove to people we can run the ball. So now here we are. It's a huge factor. What do you think it's going to be?
So, I think it's a huge factor in the offense overall. I don't know that I think it's going to necessarily change Marvin Harrison Jr.'s targets. You're right. I mean, he is still a focal point in this offense. And I think even if you decrease the number of times that you throw the ball overall, I don't think you want to decrease the number of times that the ball is going towards Marvin Harrison Jr. So that's what they kind of have to reconcile. There's a lot of reasons why you would think, as the base foundation of this offense, to really try to run the ball effectively and do it even more than he did last year, or not a ton. I'm not saying it's going to be like a 2-to-1 ratio, but a slight lean back in that area. But you've still got to get the ball to the best player in college football. So I think it affects the offense overall. I'm actually not sure it's going to affect Marvin Harrison Jr. much overall.
Stephen, how do you factor it in?
I think I agree with Nathan, but that's probably where I'm coming from. I mean, they ran the ball more last year than I thought. Than both of us thought that they may maybe do it. So maybe they lean more back in the other way of they look at the Georgia game, and go, that's our formula. Maybe we should do more of that more often. And so maybe you throw the ball even more. But even regardless of which way you lean, Marvin Harrison Jr. is a guy they're going to put the ball in the hands of, and so I don't think whatever they do doesn't really impact that much how they use Marvin Harrison Jr. and how much he gets the ball.
So how much do you believe, Stephen, defenses will take him away, will successfully take him away, will lean his way so much that reduces the target number? Because it's like, well, oh my gosh, they're double teaming Marv. All the safety helps over there. It's Julian one-on-one. We think Julian can smoke their third best corner on the opposite side, and we're just going to throw to Julian. Do you think that will have any kind of substantive impact on Marv's stats?
No. And it's because I think that they're going to move Marv all over the place. I actually kind of believe them in this idea this year that guys can play anywhere. Because Brian Hartline, when we talked to guys on Tuesday, he said something. He was like, the X receiver is just a guy who's opposite side of the formation. He's on the backside. So and the Z receiver is always on the same side as the tight end. Well, all you got to do is move the tight end in motion. All of a sudden, your X receiver becomes your Z receiver. Your Z receiver becomes your X receiver. They showed some things in the Georgia game where they were bringing Marvin in motion into the slot. They were putting the tight end on the same side as him. So now he's a Z receiver. I think they're going to do enough here to where I don't think any team can just take Marvin away for too long.
I think there's that. And I also think, so complete this sentence, fill in this blank. Julian Fleming is the blank best receiver in the Big Ten. It's like fourth? like who is better than him besides Harrison and Njigba?
Yeah.
And I don't think we're being homers here. I'm talking about just like demonstrably what is on the field. Now we don't know. There's several guys just left the Big Ten. There could be some younger guys who step up and prove themselves. But you know what I'm saying? Like I think if you're an
Yeah.
opposing defense, as much as you want to have an awareness of Marvin Harrison Jr. at all times, as far as what you schematically do on the field and where you're loading a defense, how much can you really afford to overcorrect towards him when the other guys on the field are Emeka Egbuka and Julian Fleming, and then whoever you're going to beyond that? I mean, how many teams are they going to play who don't have one receiver that would be in Ohio State's top, whatever number, 4, 5, 6, 8? And I'm not even just talking about the non-conference games. Like there's going to be conference opponents who their defenses don't face anything like this even in practice. So that's why I think, yes, it's going to be. I think you have to, if you're an opposing defense, you have to come at this in other ways. You have to rattle the quarterback and rush the quarterback and screw him up more than you have to rely on your 3/low 4-star cornerback to defend Marvin Harrison Jr. one-on-one, or to overload things, overcorrect things, overemphasize something schematically that's going to leave other guys wide open.
I think I'm looking at this right. Top 9 Big Ten receivers last season in receiving yards per game. The only 2 back are Marvin and Emeka.
Yep.
The other 7 are gone. Keon Coleman transferred from Michigan State to Florida State. Charlie Jones from Purdue is gone to the NFL. Trey Palmer's gone from Nebraska. All those kind of guys. Jaden Reed's gone. So, point taken on that. Okay, so let's talk Marv targets then, because I'm so excited to have the stats. Last year, do you guys want to guess Marv's average targets per game last season? What the number was? Want to venture a
I think, doesn't PFF have the targets? That's what I used.
Yeah. So I don't want to answer.
I don't have to guess. I can tell you what they said.
Okay.
I just have it written down as well. So you just say it.
Okay, so I was all excited. I got the target stats, and you guys like, I have that's too. What are you talking about? So 9.2 is 9.2. What you guys are looking
That's
at?
correct. Yeah.
9.01 is 9.07 is what I saw, but yeah, roughly.
So I have that tied for 37th in the country, 14th in the Power 5 in number of targets, which is, good, but I don't know, maybe could be a little more. Jackson's year is so weird. It's like you can't even reference 2021 because he basically had 2 seasons. Because Jackson, in breaking Ohio State's all-time record, had 8.6 targets per game, which is less than that. But once they started throwing to him, Jackson's targets in the last 5 games of the year, 17, 10, 10, 12, 16. And in the beginning of the year, it was 2, 11, 3, 6, 6, 6, 6, 7. So Garrett missed the Nebraska game. He got 17 targets and went nuts, and then they just kept throwing the ball to him. And then neither Garrett nor Chris were there in the Utah Rose Bowl, and he had 16 targets in that game. So trying to use like Jackson as a target reference is not great. Devontae Smith, his Heisman year, averaged 11.4 targets per game. Jamar Chase, 2019, averaged 9 targets per game.
And
those
so did
2
Jefferson,
seasons,
roughly.
Yeah, I had Jefferson like 8.9 or something. Yeah, so this is part of it too. It's like, how much do you think Emeka is Justin Jefferson? If Emeka Egbuka is Justin Jefferson, well, then we're probably not in a world where you're going to super lean hard into one guy.
And he's referenced that. He's referenced him. Emeka numerous times has referenced the Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase. Not just because they're good, but it's like what the pairing is and how like you got like this physical big play X receiver, and then this dude who just like racks up catches on the slot and just makes everything happen. And then now obviously they're being used all over the place in the NFL.
So the most targets that Marv had in a game last year was 12. He didn't have a game over 12. Devontae Smith in his Heisman year had 6 games of 13 targets or more. Jamar Chase in 2019 had 2 games of 13 targets or more. Mm-hmm. This is, by what I looked at, Marv's targets per game. 11, 9, 6, 6, 6, 9, 10, 12, 8, 12, 10, 10, 10. So remarkably similar. And the 6s are like, oh, it's Toledo and Rutgers and games where they have a huge lead and they take him out. But he averaged 9.2, and they pretty much threw him the ball about 10 times every game. So let me bring up one in particular. 48 passes in the Michigan game for Ohio State. These are the targets. Emeka, 15. Marv, 10. Cade Stover, 7. Julian Fleming and Xavier Johnson, 6 each. And everybody else, 4. So, Nathan, I think my opinion on the Marvin targets is 9 or 10 a game makes sense, but when it's money time, I don't think 10 targets on 48 passes in the Michigan game is enough for Marvin Harrison Jr. So this is doubling back, folding into the conversation we've had many, many times now. What does Ohio State do best? Throw the ball. What do they have to do to beat Michigan? Throw the ball successfully. Well, CJ averaged 350 passing yards per game in the last 2 Michigan games, and they still lost. This is a little bit of a thing, Nathan, of like, okay, 15 targets for Mecca, that's great. But like this feels like not exactly a red flag, but I don't think Marv can have 20% of your targets in the Michigan game when he's the most dangerous receiver in college football. It has to be higher, Nathan. So to me, I'm good on the regular, like the average game, and even the Penn State game, Stephen, that you were referencing, 12 targets. It's not like it's 17. He had 10 catches on 12 targets. So that is 9 or 10 normal games, but when it's time to win, I am interested in some 15 target games for Marvin Harrison Jr., Nathan. What do you think?
I totally understand where you're coming from, and it's a premise that on paper you obviously support. Now, obviously, when you're pulling one game out of it, there's a lot of context that's missing because to some extent, with an offense with this many weapons, you're taking what the defense gives you. So there's a fine line there between how much are you forcing it to Marvin Harrison Jr. and how much is forcing it to him not worth it if you can get the easy completion to Emeka Egbuka. So the number that jumped out to me there a little bit was 12 combined targets for Fleming and Xavier Johnson. Like that's where I think the balance could probably. Do you find a way to get the ball to Marvin Harrison Jr. 2 more times? And how does that change the complexion of a game, especially a tight one like that?
I see where you guys are coming from. I just don't agree with it. I think I think it's because you guys are coming at it from the perspective of how can the offense help Marv in terms of just getting him the ball. I am more in the corner of how can Marv help himself by just doing more. So since we're going to bring the LSU comparison up, Jamar Chase also averaged like 20 yards per catch that season, and he had 684 yards after the catch. So he was. It's not just the fact that like he was catching it every time he got it because he had the same around the same number of targets. He had 121 targets in 2019. So it's like the same usage. He just did more with the ball. And you used the term most dangerous with Marvin Harrison Jr. I don't agree with that. I think he's the best wide receiver. I don't think he's the most.
Stop. We are now officially moving into the Stephen Mean zone of I love the receiver, and then as soon as then I'm on to the next guy. You are transitioning. We are moving to a Mecca time. You've gone from you are a serial receiver dater. Your relationships with receivers last 4 months, and then you're on to the next one. You're like, I love Garrett. No, I love Jackson. I love Marv. Now I love Emeka.
That's not what I'm
Stephen
saying.
Means is saying, I'm not saying. You're saying Marvin Harrison Jr. is not their most dangerous receiver. You're going to like, well, he's the best, but he's not the most dangerous. You'd rather get. Go ahead. I'm just preparing people
because
for serial receiver dater. Stephen Means. Joel Klatt said he's the best non-quarterback talent in the history of college football. And you're about to say, well, he's Noah Mecca.
Yeah, Joel stole my bus keys and then turned it into a rocket ship.
No, you don't get your bus. You sold your bus. You know what you do? You don't buy buses, you lease buses. You're a bus leaser. So you can get the brand new model next year.
Why do you sound
I
so
drive
hurt?
the same. I've had the same bus. No, because you don't get to claim. You don't. You're like claim. You're throwing out. You redo your wardrobe every year. I have shirts that are older than you are. Stephen Means. Stephen Means is like, I wore this shirt 3 times. I'm gonna throw it away.
I do that. No, but what I am saying though is Emeka Ibuka is more dangerous right now of what we've seen from them. Emeka Ibuka is more dangerous with the ball in his hands than Marvin Harrison Jr. is. Garrett Wilson as an X receiver, when the ball got into his hands, was more dangerous than what Marvin Harrison has been as an X receiver. Can that change? Yeah, I think it can change. He would like that to change. That's why he keeps bringing up the yards after catch thing. But last year, he was elite route runner, elite ball catcher. So the next step is, can you now catch the ball and then go do something with it? If he can go do that, that's why I'm using the Jamar Chase as an example, because Jamar Chase was also those first two things while he also added that third thing, and that's what made him dangerous. Right now, Marvin Harrison is the most reliable. I know he's going to show up in the big games. I don't know every time he's going to have the explosive play where, as he said, turn something that's 20 yards into 60 yards. And that's when I think of dangerous, when a dude can do that.
I feel like they don't throw him those kind of routes as much, though. I feels like he's much more contested catch, like box a guy out, make a play on the ball in the air, like over a guy, and a guy's right there, and then you don't have the opportunity to catch the ball on the move and keep going.
But is that a result of where his development was at that time? Because with Garrett, it was the contested catches too, but they also threw him bubble screens and the jet sweeps and the pop passes and all that stuff as well. But he didn't get all that whole package until year 3. That's all I'm saying, is that in year 2 of what Marvin Harrison Jr. was, he probably wasn't ready to be a guy who can consistently do stuff after the catch. That's probably where he's headed this season, which is why they feel comfortable moving him all over the place.
They threw the ball to Cade Stover on 4th and 2 in the Michigan game. Right, Nathan? I mean, one of these things is, it's like we're having this conversation again. This folds back in. They put up good passing yards against Michigan, but how many points did they score in the second half, Nathan? 3. That's the Nathan Baird stat of the year. 3 points in the second half. I think more Marv could help that. And here's the thing. It's great, right? Yes, you have to take what the defense gives you. But if the defense says, well, we're not going to give you any Marv, you don't take 0 Marv. You have to get the ball to this guy. Now, I guess the point of like, well, if he's not as much as yards after the catch guy, so we can't just flip him little stuff and hope that he breaks a tackle and runs away from a guy and makes stuff on his own. This really is more about running some routes, beating coverage, that kind of thing. And if he's constantly double teamed or whatever, they're shading the coverage that way, it makes it more difficult. I'm for force feeding your best player in big moments. So to me, if they get to a situation and they throw the ball 48 times in the Michigan game again this year, and Marvin Harrison Jr. only has 10 targets, I think that's a failure. Now maybe, again, whatever, what does that mean? You're not maximizing, because, like, this is the thing, when I think throwing the ball is better than running the ball in modern football. But if you really want to hand the ball to your running back, you know what? Michigan's not like, well, I can't really hand it to Donovan Edwards. They're kind of taking him away. It's like, we're going to hand him the ball, and we're going to, until it works. And I think Ohio State has to lean, you got this guy here, you develop this guy, let him help you go beat Michigan and beat Notre Dame and beat Penn State. And, the Penn State's the good example. 10 catches, 12 targets. They don't win that game without Marv on offense or JT on defense. But I think when we're talking about total targets, Nathan, I think it should go up, because I think it should go up in the big games.
I agree with you from a play calling standpoint. You know what I mean? Like, I think you have to maybe come up with some decisions from the sideline in those situations that get Marvin Harrison the ball, rather than rely on your quarterback to make that decision that forces it in there, because I think that's where you get in trouble. So what can they do? What about this past season kind of open their eyes to maybe how they can, and that goes back to something Steven mentioned earlier, which is how much are they going to move him around this year and keep defenses honest that way? And I think that it is going to happen more. I think they have to, because just the combination of factors between whether it's a new quarterback and the way defenses are going to come after him and try to stop him. I think just moving him around and making defenses think on their feet is going to be crucial on all downs, but especially those ones you're talking about, those season changing downs.
So there's the how's the quarterback affected? There's the how do they choose to go about attacking a defense, balancing it with the run game, balancing it with Emeka Buka and Julian Fleming and Cade Stover and everybody else. And then I do think like there's just the general conversation, Stephen, of how much do stats really reflect how good of a receiver that you are? So when we talk about it's not the same thing, Stephen. It's the shorthand for how we all reference it, but it's not the exact same thing. But do you think, Stephen, we could have a season where Marv just matches his receiving total from last year? It's another 1263, but we are simultaneously saying that guy's the best player in college football. I cannot believe how good he was this year. But then you look down at the stats and it's 1263, because there's a part of me that looks down at the stats from last year and says it's only 1263. It sort of felt like more. Like, could we be there again? Or if he has 1263, would that mean like, it didn't quite go as everybody hoped for whatever reason? The tackles didn't hold up. Quarterback play wasn't as good. The play calling transition didn't really work. And that 1263 would be, if he's healthy, would be, quote, a disappointment. Or can it be a barn burning 1263?
It depends on what it looks like and who it's against, because that was the case this past year. It's the fact that he had three catches for 18 yards and a touchdown against Rutgers. Okay, it's Rutgers. People are going to look at that and go, oh, it's because probably he was sitting on the sideline in the second half. The Wisconsin game got out of hand so quickly that there was no reason to throw the ball. So him having 3 for 45, who cares? But Penn State, 10-185. The Michigan State game, which is like on ABC, and everybody's watching it, and he's doing all this freaky stuff. So it's like, does he coaches used to say this a lot when I was a kid. When the lights are on, it's time to perform. Marvin performs when those lights are on and everybody's paying attention to him. And I think that's going to matter more than whatever he does against young. Like, is anybody going to dock him if he only has like 2 catches for 25 yards against Youngstown State? Probably not. As long as against in Michigan,
the Heisman race will. The Heisman race will.
Yeah, but that's a fine line to draw with wide receivers anyway. Like, you got to be on every single week to win that type of award. But to win the Biletnikoff award, it's like, did you have 10 catches for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns against Michigan? Did you have 9 catches for 145 yards and a touchdown against Notre Dame? That's, I think, what's going to matter more, because it's just hard with anybody who's not a quarterback to envision a Heisman race this early in May.
Yeah, the Heisman thing is you have to be so over the top numbers wise that I don't think we're talking about 2 different things there. I mean, it's one of his yardage total. I think at the end of the day, as long as it's in this neighborhood of what we're talking about, it's not going to have any effect on how good Ohio State is. I mean, how their outcome is. Like, and as far as like his numbers looking underwhelming last year, so maybe just in terms of sheer yardage, but there were 2 Power 5 receivers who had more than 10 touchdown catches last year, who averaged more than 14 yards a catch, and they were both well over 14 yards a catch. Marvin Harrison, 16.4, Jalen Hyatt, 18.9. So when you look at the full body of work, it's not just the yardage can be a misleading stat. It's what are you doing with every catch and how often are you getting in the end zone. And Marvin Harrison Jr. has shown definitely he knows what to do on the second half of that thing, even if he didn't get to Steven's stratospheric prediction. And also, I think he has given us reason to think that the first half of that was already really strong compared to everybody in the country and could be even better this year.
It is odd, a little odd, that like nobody in the country got to 1,400 receiving yards last year. It's kind of interesting. Like, there's, we're talking about, because one of the lines in the sand for me, right? The main line in the sand is, will he break Jackson's record? I really think that's the main discussion point of this. Will Marvin Harrison Jr. put up the biggest receiving season in Ohio State football history? So like that, to me, if you're really getting down to it, if we were not making a prediction, but if this was a yes/no question, my yes/no wouldn't be 100 yards per game. It wouldn't be 2,000 yards for the season. It would be, will he break the record? But if we're talking about that, again, Jackson, it's whatever, 1606. Nobody in the nation, Nathan, it was 1398 led the nation last year. I almost like, what are people doing? Are people not throwing the ball anymore? So I have some more numbers from a Power 5 perspective, but one of the things is that, Ohio State was late to the party in the evolution of the passing game in college football, but Jackson's year, and that's the thing about Jackson's year, it's like, well, it was this, but also was supplemented by a 350-yard game in the bowl game, which is like, okay, that's what takes that from, if he just has a normal game in the bowl game, then he's like third all time in Ohio State history. He's not first. So that wraps into it. But I think it's worth remembering that it's not like, 1606 for Jackson in 2021 was third in the country, first in the Power 5. And last year, nobody got higher than 1398, Nathan. So we do have to remember, it's not like people are dropping 2,000-yard seasons all over the place.
No, exactly. And we maybe, in retrospect, were a little bit over our skis last year. I mean, we were all predicting Jaxon Smith-Njigba 1,800 yards and above. And the fact that he was the slot guy with C.J. Stroud, I would defend how the upper echelon of what we were looking at there, but that extreme also again proved how hard this is to like perform statistically at an exceptionally high level in multiple years, because a lot of these other names that we've dropped, whether it's Jamar Chase or Justin Jefferson or Devontae Smith, it's not like they have multiple 15, 16, 1,800 yard seasons in their careers. Like it's rare.
Okay, when we come back, it's going to be time to mark it down. We'll do it next on Buckeye Talk. Doug, Nathan, Steven, 614-350-3315. If you'd like to be a tech subscriber, you send a text to that number, you get back a link, you sign up for a 2-week free trial. Last 14 years of college football. In the Power 5, if we're trying to set this 1606 from Jackson as some kind of number, last 14 years, there have been 11 total receivers in Power 5 football to have more yards than that. So it's fewer than one per year. Of those 11, 6 are Big 12 chucking around dudes. Baylor guys, and Oklahoma State guys, and a Missouri guy before they left the Big 12, and a West Virginia guy when they got to the Big 12. Like the no defense, chuck it around, run and shoot, air raid, it's not really comparable to what Ohio State's trying to do. That's 6 of the 11. Here are the other 5 guys. So if you're saying to yourself, I'm going to predict that Marvin will break Jaxon Smith-Njigba's record. In the last 14 years in Power 5 football, non-chucking around Big 12 guys, here's the 5 guys who are above Jackson. 2012, Marquise Lee at USC. He went on to be a second-round pick in the NFL. Good receiver. 2013, Brandon Cooks at Oregon State. Went on to be a first-round pick in the NFL. He's still around. Brandon Cooks has made a nice career for himself. 2014, Amari Cooper. Third in the Heisman race. Very familiar to Ohio State fans. They beat Amari Cooper in the playoff semifinal. Wound up being the 4th pick in the draft. And then the 2 reference points that we keep using. 2019, Jamar Chase. Went on to be the 5th pick. 2020, Devontae Smith wins the Heisman. Goes on to be the number 10 pick. That's not a lot of people, Nathan. But I think that's a decent cohort to try to envision Marv joining, which is the 1606 or more in an offense that's not a chuck it around at all costs, an offense that's elite talent across the board, that's trying to win and not just put up stats. It's not a big group, but could you envision Marvin in that group when we talk about, and again, we're going to have a million podcasts about how good he is. This is stats. This is a statistic. Could you imagine him in this statistical group when you hear those 5 names, Nathan?
I do. I think there's a couple of factors to remember here, though. Number one is, we've brought up Jaxon Smith-Njigba a few times, but there is a difference. Even if they're going to move Marvin Harrison around, there is a difference between being the primary slot receiver at Ohio State and being a more perimeter receiver. The other thing, though, is just the number of games played. And I guess we'll talk about that more in our prediction, but that's going to be a big factor here. But I've tried to find comparable guys who were the same sort of style of receiver. I thought that was important. And because the offense can vary, like sometimes you're the you're one of two great guys like LSU 2019 in a very heavy passing offense. Maybe you're the one great guy in an offense that doesn't throw the ball that much. But I think there's comparables in both segments.
Okay. Let me start with where the texters went. And I gave them maybe too many categories, and people are like, Doug, it's supposed to be fun. Like, what? What is this? I'm at work. Am I supposed to pick between 9 different categories of whether Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to have 1,411 receiving yards or 1,506? What? I don't know. It's June. Why are you doing this to me? Great ad. People are always like, hey, how do you encourage people on the podcast to join the texts? By that. It feels like homework at work in the summer. Why are you doing? So I gave too many categories, but in the end, do you think he's going to break Jackson's record or not? It's not a bad way to do it. 80% basically no, Stephen. 80% of the votes are not for 16-6 or more. Why do you think that is, Stephen? In a world where we've talked about Marvin Harrison Jr. as one of the most hyped players going into a season in Ohio State history.
It's because he's not in the slot. We haven't spent 6 months talking about how, look at the connection he has with the quarterback. Oh, look at that connection. We don't know who the quarterback is. And I do think, even with the guys you listed, who were his teammates? Who was the other receiver in the room with them? Like, that matters here. Because when you're the only guy, I think it's more feasible to think that. Because even with Jackson, so much of that 1606 is wrapped up in the Rose Bowl when Garrett and Chris didn't play, and the Nebraska game when Garrett didn't play. So something had to be missing for Jackson to really go off like that. So unless you're telling me Emeka and Julian are going to be abducted by aliens, which, I mean, knock on wood with how this team can sometimes, then there's somebody who's going to take away from what Marvin Harrison does, regardless of what the defense is doing, because he's the best receiver in the country, but he's also playing with arguably the second best receiver in the country. And the third guy is like at least top 15. That's probably fair to say. Plus, Cade Stover has proven he probably deserves the ball a little bit. And maybe they get back to throwing the ball to a healthy Travion Henderson as well. So there's just too many options to go all in this year of one guy's just going to get the ball so much that it breaks records. At least not this record.
If you have any hesitation about whether they're going to beat Michigan this year, then Marvin Harrison Jr. may only play 12 games. And getting 1606 out of 12 games is tough.
Well, 13, because they'd make a bowl.
But he wouldn't play.
But he wouldn't play in it. That's my point.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true.
Most likely.
If they don't back into the playoff by not, if they don't do exactly what they did last year, then he's in a bowl. He's probably not playing it.
That's true.
So 19% of the vote has him under last year's total, Nathan. There's a very slim margin that has him under 1,000, but there's a decent chunk of people. It was the third most popular category. I sort of made it between like 1,000 and 1,262, which we have him under last year. But just overall, all the different categories, about 20% of the people say under last year. What is that? Is that a hedge on health? Is that people taking him away? I was a little surprised.
Yes, all those. Whatever. You stopped yourself from listing things, but if you had kept listing things, the answer would have just been yes. Because collectively, I'm going to predict a number that is more than last year, but if I had to bet on something, I might bet under. Because if you were to add up just from a math standpoint, percentage of health, and he's shown no health problems at this point, but fluky things can happen. Defensive attention, first-year quarterback, what we just said about the number of games played. There's any number of factors that when you take whatever percentage of likelihood you think are there, you stack all those together, it can get you a number where Marvin Harrison Jr. is just as good of a football player or better than he was last year, but the statistical result of that just isn't the same as last year. And that's just one of those things that happens.
So the biggest category that won, 60% of the people have him more than last year, but short of Jackson's record. So that's 1,263 to 1,605, which is, that's 100 yards per game, no matter let's say he only plays 12 games. But if he plays 13 or 14 or 15 games, and it is the wild card in any kind of statistical prediction for college football, you don't know how many games you're predicting. Are you predicting just a regular season and a bowl game opt-out? Are you predicting a Big Ten championship game or not? A bowl that a guy does play in, a playoff semifinal? It's very reasonable. Anything between 12 and 15 is very reasonable. That's a huge gap. I mean, it's like he could have 3 200-yard games in the Big Ten championship game and 2 playoff games. That's an extra 600 yards on a prediction like this. So most people are in that range, Stephen, of like a pretty comfortable, like a 13, 14, 15. 1,300 to 1,500, like even 1,600, very comfortable, good. I don't think anybody would be disappointed with that. If he gets up into at least like 1425 or whatever it is, he'd be second all time to Jaxon, but he doesn't get over the top. That feels like a nice, warm, cozy place to be, Stephen, that there's just a lot of, you can account for a lot of different things. Figure he winds up around 100 yards per game and settle in right there and not have to think about it too much.
That's where I landed. He averaged 5.9 catches for 97.2 yards per game last season. When I was coming up with my number, I said that I just gave him an extra 10-yard catch per game this year. So 6.9 catches for 107.2 yards. And then I just did the math through what that looks like through 12 games, what that looks like through 14 games, and what that looks like through 15. I didn't do 13 because you're right. Like, unless somehow it works out the way it did this year, he's not playing in a bowl game. That's not a playoff game. So I just did the math through 12, 14, and 15 to come up with my answer.
All right. So what are you marking down it? How are you marking it down, Stephen?
So I gave him the only way he breaks Jackson's record when I did the math was if they play 15 games, and that would be 104 catches for 1,608 yards. That's the only way it does that. I'm not comfortable saying this team is going to the national championship yet because we're not marking that down. I don't have to. So I did the averages of the 12, 13, 14, and 15 games and what that would look like. And I came up with 93 catches for 1,447 yards. And also, for the sake of saying it, I know we're not doing this on this pod, but I'm doubling down on Marvin Harrison breaks the touchdown record this year. I think he can get 4 more touchdowns than he had last year.
Like 35? You're doubling your prediction? 35 touchdowns?
No, I said I'm doubling it down. If he gets 35 touchdowns, that's... I don't even know what that would look like.
If he doesn't break Jackson's record, but he averages 5 touchdowns per game, would people be disappointed? First 50 touchdown season in college football history? I don't know. What would people think?
I think that might get him that Heisman you're talking about, regardless of his yardage numbers.
Yeah. Maybe
1,100 yards, 53 touchdowns. I don't know. You just got how could it work itself out? All right, 1447. I watched a little documentary about The Price is Right the other day. I think it's kind of old. Bob Barker's still alive, by the way, and he was in the documentary. They interviewed him. He was very, very old. But it was about a guy who studied The Price is Right and figured it out. Nathan's like, oh, I've watched that documentary 6 times. What are you talking about?
Watch it once.
It was interesting.
Watch it once.
It was interesting. It was if you grew up watching The Price is Right when you were homesick from school, which is 4 generations of kids have done that. It was an interesting documentary, Nathan.
Yeah, and the first time I heard about that story, one of the great magazine writers alive, Chris Jones, wrote a big takeout of that story several years ago for, I think, Esquire, and that was what was eventually turned into that documentary. But yeah, it's a really compelling story about who this guy was and how he did it and why he did it. I would definitely, it's a strong recommend. People should watch that documentary. It's fun.
I felt a little bit bad because I thought the guy in the documentary was pretty interesting. I almost felt like I could hang out with this guy, and it felt like he spent most of his life by himself in front of a computer figuring out The Price is Right. And I was like, man, you want to hang out? You want to go get some wings? What are we doing here? Okay. Nathan, what are you marking down?
So just a quick tour through my math, how I came up with this. A slight uptick in targets for all the reasons that we talked about, that they could be more or less. Had him for 129 targets for the year. By the way, I'm basing this on 14 games because I couldn't bring myself to only say right now in June that Ohio State's only going to play 12 games, but also 13 is a number that's very weird. It'd have to happen in exactly the way last year. So I went 14 games, basically coming out to I got him to 90 receptions. And then for yardage, I basically took last year's I took the yards after the catch out of his yardage total last year. I took whatever that number, that was like 12.2 yards, and then added in yards per after the catch from what I think he could do this year at that. And I took him from like 4.2, whatever he averages this year, to around like 7, which is still actually kind of on the low end, but I thought I was trying to be conservative in the number I was coming up with. So all that math still got me over 14 games to 1,637 yards. So I still have him breaking the record.
You guys are doing good math here. I like the math. 3,000. No, I'm just kidding. So here, Marvin Harrison Jr. in his career only has 2 games of more than 140 receiving yards.
Mm-hmm.
It's the 180 against Arkansas State and the 180 against Penn State. It's just surprising to me.
He's just consistent.
He is consistent, but I'm waiting for an explosion. Buckeye talk. So my math is simpler than what you guys did. I took 13 games at 110 yards per game. Like good, consistent. I do think the 3 catches for 18 yards, maybe that'll hedge up a little bit. It's like, all right, we're going to take Marv out, but I don't know. Do we want to throw him the ball a little bit so he might have 51 yards in this game instead of 18? So you hedge those up a little bit. So your bottom comes up, and then you just have a couple more, like 146s here, that it's not that his consistency is like the 2 peaks against Arkansas State and Penn State, and then a lot of like 102s. So I just, for those 13 games, 110, and then I gave him an explosion game. So my math is 110 yards per game times 13 is 1,430. And then I threw in a 250-yard game, like the Marv Goes Nuts game. I don't know. Maybe Phil Longo chucks it around for Wisconsin. Ohio State feels like it has to score. Wisconsin doesn't really have anybody who can cover him. And Marv goes 14 catches for 261 against Wisconsin. And they need it in a 52-38 win, like that kind of thing. And then the rest of the time, not that he's 110 every game, but I just think he could have more like 100-yard games. So that got me to 1,680. So that's based off a 14-game season, which is, again, it's hard to pick a national title game, but that does get over the record. He becomes the single season leader for Ohio State, but it doesn't, Devontae Smith again. And as the thing, Stephen, that you referenced is like, all right, well, I mean, Jamar Chase did have Justin Jefferson, which we said 1,000 times. That's a little different. The whole thing with Devontae Smith is he's not even their number 1 receiver. Jalen Waddle gets hurt and Devontae Smith takes over because it's like, well, who else am I going to throw to? Mac Jones is like, here. So like that, as much as, I like that reference point, that part of it would require a focus on Marv that just probably isn't going to exist. Again, Devontae Smith, 11.4 targets per game that year. Marv was at 9.2 last year. I do think there are more opportunities to just sort of force it to him in some games. And I'd like to see a 16-target game in there somewhere, Stephen. And it doesn't mean every week. But when you look, and again, it's a very hard comparison because the depth of talent at Ohio State is so different. This is Charlie Jones at Purdue, who, again, was an Iowa guy who transferred to Purdue last year. It was like a one-man offense for Purdue last season. He averaged 12.2 targets per game. These were his targets: 19, 10, 14, 11, 10, 7, 16, 13, 19, 7, 8, 9, 16. So he has 2 16s, 2 19s, and a 14, Stephen. And I know this isn't that. I know that. But there's a part of me that's like, well, if Charlie Jones could have 5 games of 14 or more, could Marv have 2? That's all. And that would require, I think, we're going to do this. Or we're gonna move him around the formation to make sure they can't do what they want to do to stop him. And so if you do that, I think you tick up a little bit, Stephen. But I don't know. Maybe I'm too focused on that.
There's something there. And how many games does he have where it's just like, let's just get it to Marv? Which is why I am so hyper focused on the yards after the catch. I just want to see him be more explosive with it when he gets it. Because really, the Georgia game was the epitome of that. Because looking at it, he had 6 games where he averaged 15 yards or less per catch last season, and he only had 2 games where he averaged at least 20 yards per catch. And that was the Arkansas State game where he also had 3 touchdowns, and then the Georgia game before he got knocked out, he was averaging 21.2 yards per catch. So it's like, can he just be more explosive when he gets that ball in his hands? Because right now, I have a hard time envisioning when you say when Marv goes nuts. I don't think yards first. I think, oh, he had 3 touchdowns right now. So if he can combine he gets in the end zone, but also it's like Marv had like 4 plays where he had like 30-yard catches, right? And some of it is because he literally just had a 30-yard catch, and some of it is because it was a 7-yard slant. He broke off the first dude, and the safety just beat the safety, and he ended up getting more yards than he should have gotten in that play. So it is, some of it is on how do they use him, but then it's like, what does he do with the ball in his hands? Can he be more explosive than he was last year? Because that's the only, if you want to call it, flaw in his game right now.
You mentioned not having any games over, what was it, 130 in 2021? So Garrett Wilson in the X had 0 games over 130. Had 5 games he was between 117 and 126. There's some of this that I wonder if this is just what the X receiver does in Ohio State's offense for the most part. So I think Marvin Harrison Jr. can be better. I think he is. I mean, if he's putting his mind to being better at yards after the catch, he's going to be better at yards after the catch. That's just what happens here. This is what he is. He's that kind of machine. And so I think that'll happen. But I think the moving him around, there may be routes that he will run in 2023 that open him up to some of these bigger plays that he just wasn't running as much in 2022 because that wasn't his role in the offense. The same as it wasn't for Garrett Wilson before him.
All right, final markdown. I am at 1,680. Nathan is at 1,637. Stephen is at 1,447. That means Nathan and I predict that he will break the Ohio State single season record. Stephen has him coming up a little bit short. So make your kids mark it down. Hey, kids, what's your Marv number? Make your parents, make your siblings, make your friends, make your aunts, make your uncles, make your cousins, make your coworkers, make your neighbors. You're standing at the fence. You're talking about your tomatoes. Also say, what's your Marv number? I would like the Ohio State fan base across the country this June to be asking each other, what's your Marv number? Mark it down. We'll do more of these. We do it on Mondays. We'll have some lined up through the course of the summer and then into August. We like making these predictions. It makes us get down. And again, the statistical stuff is very informative. It's not the same thing as being good. So we know Marv's good, but what will that mean statistically? That's what we wanted to dive into here. Okay, for now, we appreciate you guys making us part of your week. For Nathan Baird and Stephen Means, I'm Doug Lesmerises. And that was Buckeye Talk.